This morning, Donald Trump just announced the new Fed chair, and the Bitcoin community is split on if this is a positive or a negative for Bitcoin. Now, Michael Saylor, the Giga Chad himself, came out and said that this is the biggest bull run on the planet. And now that Kevin Warsh will be the first pro-Bitcoin chairman of the Federal Reserve. But here's the thing. In 2022, Kevin Warsh literally said, and I quote, "Bitcoin is software pretending to be money." So which one is it? Is this guy pretending to be a Bitcoin bull, or is he actually going to be beneficial for the Bitcoin market? And we had some new regulation now go through a little bit more of a progress here in the United States government. So I'm going to go through all of that. But first, we've got to get to the bottom of the new Fed chair and his Bitcoin stance. So listen to a couple clips of him from the past on where he's talked about Bitcoin.
So I'd say I think that Bitcoin does make sense as part of a portfolio in this environment where you have the most fundamental shift, for example, in monetary policy since Paul Volcker.
So he's talking about in this environment, obviously as an inflation hedge, and saying that it has a piece in everybody's portfolio with this here going forward, simply because of the massive amounts of inflation, and looking at it as simply just an inflation hedge. But let's get to the background real quick, because Kevin Warsh is very interesting. He was a Federal Reserve governor from 2006 to 2011. He was there during the entire 2008 financial crisis. The guy was literally in the room when Lehman Brothers collapsed. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. And he's known as a monetary hawk. And he's even come out and said, inflation is a choice. So very interesting words here from the new Federal Reserve chair, especially when Donald Trump really wants very low interest rates. And Jerome Powell seemingly has been keeping interest rates elevated to tame inflation. Now, as we keep diving into the Fed chair and his past, well, we've seen this guy who's been quote unquote crypto curious, where it's never existed before. Because if you're trying to figure out what this means for their portfolio, you guys need to be paying attention. So make sure you guys are subscribed, hit that like button as well, because let's listen to the Hoover Institute, interview back in 2025, where he was talking about Bitcoin here in this. So now, if you guys are in the chat, let me know if you've got the audio in here. Sometimes Twitter get weird.
Bitcoin does not make me nervous. I can hearken back to a dinner I had here in 2011 with someone who is another guest on your show. I won't say his name. Okay, I just did Mark Andreessen, who showed me the white paper. That was the original white paper. I wish I had understood as clearly as he did how transformative Bitcoin and this new technology would be.
And now he said it right there, right? The new Fed chair admits he saw the Bitcoin white paper back in 2011 and wishes he understood better. But keep listening, because it gets really interesting right around here.
Bitcoin doesn't trouble me. I think of it as an important asset that can help inform policymakers when they're doing things right and wrong. It is not a substitute to the dollar. I think it can often be a very good policeman for policy.
Now, did you hear that? That is something that is very interesting, because he's on that side of the aisle. He's not saying Bitcoin is money. He is saying that essentially Bitcoin is a signal, right? A way to tell whether or not the Fed is screwing up. And when Bitcoin pumps, it might mean that the Fed is printing too much money. And when it dumps, it might mean that policy is working. So he sees it as a tool, not a threat, not a replacement, but simply a tool. So now, when he said this back in 2022 in the Wall Street Journal, he said it's, crypto is a misnomer. It isn't money. He basically discredited it and said that Bitcoin is software looking to be money. So in 2022, we see Kevin Warsh go from Bitcoin isn't money to 2025 to essentially explaining what's exactly happening here. But let's see why all of this market reaction has actually occurred, because it has been very interesting. When you look at the Bitcoin market, we actually saw a decent bit of a tank here today following this announcement. And that didn't just happen in Bitcoin, it happened in the market as a whole. So when we get in and dive into all of this, right, we see it went and took a big plummet when Trump announced all this. And the only people that seemingly got this call right was the Kalshi and the prediction markets. But anyway, Bitcoin was trading around 90K earlier this week. And the moment warish odds spiked on Polymarket, Bitcoin dropped to 81,000. It's almost a $10,000 drop in hours. $777 million in leverage longs got liquidated in 1 hour, 1.75 billion in the last 24 hours. And Bitcoin slumps to a 2-year low. So why did the market freak out? Here's what traders are thinking, right? Because warish is historically a hawk, right? I mean, this should basically make enough sense for itself, right? I mean, he's essentially been, a very hawkish in his stance. But during the 2008 financial crisis, when the economy was collapsing and when unemployment was skyrocketing in flight, he was still worried about inflation. Here's an actual quote from September 2008. This is the month the Lehman Brothers collapse. He said, "I'm still not ready to relinquish my concerns on the inflation front. The economy is in a free fall. Banks are free falling, and Warsh is worried about inflation." 7 months later, in 2009, April, unemployment at 9%, inflation basically to zero. He says, "I continue to be worried about the upside risk to inflation than the downside risks." This is why traders panicked. They're thinking the hawk Fed chair equals higher interest rates, equals less liquidity, equals bad for Bitcoin. But here's what they're missing. And this is where it gets really interesting. There's something happening right now in the overall regulation market that, makes me very positive for this move. Of course, like I said, Warsh has been very, let's say, pro Bitcoin in his recent tenure. But something that Trump said here the other day made it very interesting and had some positiveness for all of this. So let's listen into what Trump had to say.
We're going to do something great with crypto because we don't want China or anybody else, not just China, but others are embracing it, and we want to be the head.
So Trump is still doubling and tripling down even after naming, Kevin Warsh as the Fed chair for all of this. So, when we get down and get the full picture of who he actually is, he's 55, right? He was appointed to the Fed governor at 35 in 2006, the youngest Fed governor in history at that time. But before the Fed, he was at Morgan Stanley. He was an assistant to George W. Bush for economic policy. He was an executive secretary for the National Economic Council. And during the Fed, he was on the board for the entire 2008 financial crisis. And after the Fed, he was at the Hoover Institution. So he's got a very big background. It's not some random political appointee. This guy was in the room during the worst financial crisis of all time. And so when you take in and see how the Fed chair is really just looking at the overall, market, it is, really interesting because we see gold and silver absolutely plummeting, right? With the news of this. Is this because they have faith in the Fed chair essentially fixing inflation? It is, really, I guess, interesting to see how the market is reacting with all of this, right? Because as we continue to dive into, the Fed and how that the policy can be essentially connected to all of this, it's really, interesting, right? Because once the Fed and Kevin Warsh be pro crypto, for Bitcoiners, he'll still be a hawk, right? I mean, look at this. This is a great meme. He's still got, the money printer in the back of his mind because of Trump, right? So he was, a great guy. He had a good track record, and he echoed Trump's criticism of the Fed being, quote, too slow to cut interest rates. So watching him succeed Jerome Powell means that, there's potentially going to be somebody here that will be cutting interest rates very quickly. And this might line out for a big environment on how the overall market is going to react, right? I mean, it's just a matter of time until the Fed really starts to double and triple down through this kind of interest rate environment, right? So when we keep on diving into the recent Fed chair and we look at how, Warsh has been nominated, his reputation was the hawk. So this kind of caused the recent market crash. And many economists think that this hawkishness actually made the crisis even worse. If his approach had been implemented, we might have been able to see, higher unemployment, potentially a slower recovery. And Kevin Warsh's monetary policy of a hawk his entire career, and his deficits today stems from the convenience. The presidential risk will get duped because essentially he has a big background with Donald Trump. I mean, him and Donnie T go back for quite some time. His father-in-law is a big donor to the Trump campaign. So they've been intertwined for some bit. But on this Kevin Warsh news, I think, taking a step back and looking into the way that policy has been developed, that's where it gets really interesting because, this complicated story with quote unquote crypto and how this will break down is that, even though he's been skeptical of crypto as money, he's been invested in Bitcoin startups and central bank engagement, digital money, and been more pragmatic rather than hostile to these different crypto, tokens, let's say, right? And he knows Trump's stance. He knows that Trump wants to be the leader in this industry. So, I think he's going to be very friendly for the Bitcoin industry. Now, I don't think that he's going to come in and straight cut rates dramatically like everybody is maybe anticipating. And this is potentially why we've seen the market crash here. But we've got something that is moving through Congress really quickly that has followed up the Genius Act. And it's the Clarity Act, and it's moving very quickly. But before we get into the Clarity Act, when you see a potentially bullish, chairman of the Federal Reserve come in for the Bitcoin industry, you don't want to sell your Bitcoin. So if you don't want to sell your Bitcoin, the best place to borrow against that is Salt Lending. You can go to saltlending.com/green-candle today. They'll give you guys an exclusive rate at 9.95%, term durations of 1, 3, or 5 years, and you could borrow up to 70% loan to value with no prepayment fees. The best of all, when you see crashes like this, you ain't got to worry because they've got a no liquidation solution over at Salt if you get that Salt Shield, and they're giving an exclusive offer for Green Candle listeners. So make sure you guys go to saltlending.com/green-candle today, and you can get 50 basis points off the biggest or the best rate that they can give you. Now, let's dive into what I was hinting at earlier, the Clarity Act, right? Because originally, Brian Armstrong has essentially been at odds with the U.S. government. And, essentially everybody has been looking at how Armstrong and this overall market has been playing out, right? So Armstrong didn't like initially what he saw out of this Clarity Act. And he said he's going to be pulling Coinbase's, let's say, support for this bill. And now he's actually starting to see some public backlash. And it's really interesting because JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon came out and told Brian Armstrong he's full of shit after accusing banks for blocking crypto-friendly legislation. So when we see Armstrong now pulling out of these bills, you got to ask yourself, what is Armstrong's motives with all of this? And will Trump essentially kind of push this one through and essentially, I guess, make sure that Armstrong and Jamie Dimon and all these guys can't halt any of this Bitcoin legislation coming through, because seemingly everybody that is in Trump's cabinet and moving into his cabinet has spoken positively about Bitcoin at one point in time, right? Maybe they said something negative about Bitcoin in the past, but it seems like they've all flipped the script. And so, even though I'm one to critique these banks and see, where they're potentially going, I do think that it is interesting. We see the market reacting. Basically, everybody's saying, "Oh, Bitcoin's stuck in a rut." Warsh picked as the ETF sheds billions. Like essentially a bunch of people have traded off Bitcoin and got it out of their positions once Trump nominated this Kevin Warsh character here. So, it seems the market is reacting in one way, really selling off, where, there is a lot of positive news here, especially with this Clarity and Genius Act getting passed. I mean, the stablecoin bills have been massive. Now banks are starting to get into Bitcoin. So I think the overall regulation and the regulatory clarity that is going to be coming to the United States will be positive for the market in the long run. Now, I don't necessarily agree with holding Bitcoin in a bank or, a custodian, let's say, but I think once we start to see these overall Fed policies really start to shine and potentially add some more liquidity to the market, that's where Bitcoin will be able to, I guess, really take off. So as Bitcoin is, quote, stuck in a rut here with this, we see that, we're going to see that Warsh is going to be good for Bitcoin because Bitcoin can be good for a policeman for policy, right? That's what he said a little bit earlier. And here's how he sees it, right? When the Fed screws up, when they print too much money, they'll let inflation run, they'll lose credibility, and the Bitcoin price will immediately show that. So Bitcoin pumping is a signal that Warsh will take that people are losing faith in the dollar. So Bitcoin pumping means that people are looking for alternatives to the Fed's money. Bitcoin pumping is a warning light on the Fed's dashboard. And when Bitcoin pumps under his framework, that might actually mean that Fed policy is working. People trust the dollar again. So he's not saying Bitcoin is money. He'll be using it as a metric, a signal, a way to measure whether the Fed is doing its job. Now, think about that, what that means for the Fed chair, right? If Warsh is the Fed chair and Bitcoin pumps 50%, does he see that as a success or a failure? Under his framework, it almost seems like he sees it as a failure. And that's where I think it'll be a little interesting because, Trump is a very, I guess, has his ear to the streets, let's say. And he knows that the younger generations look at Bitcoin as essentially a look on how the overall economy is doing. Just like the older generations look at the S&P 500 as, a gauge of how the economy is pushing. So when this new Fed chair would see essentially Bitcoin pumping, and it almost looks like as a negative because he looks at inflation and his number one worry in 2008 was not unemployment, was not anything else. It was more inflation. So I think that's going to be the same. And he's going to keep echoing that point here, in this next few years. And that's where I think it's something that we have to watch because for us, Bitcoin is savings technologies. It's an escape for the Fed, right? It's freedom money. It's going up equals adoption, which will be success. But Warsh might see it as the opposite, right? Time will obviously tell on this, but this is why I say Warsh is Bitcoin aware, but maybe not Bitcoin bullish. He understands Bitcoin, respects its role. He invests in the different companies. But now here's where the Clarity Act would kind of come in with all of this, right? Because as the Clarity Act is moving through regulation, well, let's take a step back and bring you guys up to speed on what's happening because this will be all connected to the original story. The Digital Asset Market Clarity Act is the most comprehensive crypto bill ever to move through Congress. It was passed through the House in July of 25, bipartisan support. But what this bill does is it defines which cryptos are commodities versus securities. It gives the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, jurisdiction over most crypto, which creates registration requirements for exchanges, establishes rules for how crypto companies operates, and then protects DeFi developers who don't custody funds. So this is what the crypto industry has been essentially begging for, at least on the company side of things. And this passed in July. And then this all happened on Friday where, last week, yesterday, when it moved through, right? And it gained the vote. But the interesting thing of all of this is that Coinbase pulled its support right? The biggest crypto exchange in America, they said that they'd rather have no bill than a bad bill. So Coinbase, the company that spent millions of dollars lobbying literally for this bill, is now publicly withdrawing its support the night before the vote, within hours. But this didn't seem to affect the Senate Banking Committee because banks don't want crypto companies offering interest on stablecoins. They'll say it'll drain deposits from the banking system and money will flow out of bank accounts. And this is where that Genius Act came in, and Trump signed that into law last year. But Coinbase offering yield, I mean, I personally don't even think that banks are really even thinking about that. So Coinbase actually cares so much about this bill, and why they've paid, so much is because they've literally made $355 million per quarter in stablecoin revenue. So a big chunk of that comes from the rewards program. So Armstrong went nuclear, but the build stalled. But here's what's interesting. Most people disagreed with Armstrong. Even Trump's own crypto advisor took a dig at Armstrong, saying, "You might not love every part of the bill, but you'll hate a future Dem version even more," right? So in summary, the crypto industry is split whether the Senate banking bill is stuck, where I think at the end, the Bitcoin industry is just simply fine with all of it because everybody realizes, hey, this is more of a crypto-centric type of movement and not a Bitcoin-centric type of movement. So when we keep looking and digging into the positives of what this happens, I mean, essentially helps people keep self-custody. Now, I think the best place to hold your Bitcoin is in a Trezor hardware wallet. So you guys could go to the affiliate link, but down below, please be sure to join that. Go to Trezor through that. It helps me, friends, show that you guys are interested in that, and it helps me pick great sponsors for you guys. So make sure you go to the affiliate link down in the comments. You guys could get the Trezor Safe 7. I'm using that now because they've got a great Bluetooth feature, so I don't need to carry a million cords with me while I'm traveling, and I can still check my Bitcoin. So be sure to go there, get your Trezor hardware wallet, and then head on over to cryptosteel.com/green-candle. You can use promo code GREENCANDLE today, and you can get 10% off your entire order because it doesn't stop with just holding Bitcoin, right? You need to make sure that you have your Bitcoin in self-custody fully backed up, right? Because if you don't, somebody else is going to take it from you. And that's what we don't want, folks, because, I think when you turn your head and look around, everybody is starting to wake up towards Bitcoin. I mean, we've essentially got, the author of Good as Gold, describing Bitcoin without actually naming Bitcoin. And we have plenty of other people really taking a look at the Bitcoin industry and really seeing how they can profit. And, at the end of the day, the biggest argument against Bitcoin for a while was that it was too volatile. But now when you see the Bitcoin, that gold is essentially acting like the Bitcoin markets and silver is acting like the Bitcoin markets, I mean, it's literally a black swan event here. Gold went down 15%, silver went down 38% in the last 24 hours. $15 trillion has been wiped out from the gold and silver markets. Literally half the GDP of the United States gone in one day. So we witnessed one of the most giant drops in history from the precious metals market. So I think people are essentially going to wake up to the fact that, hey, we're going to see more volatility in the markets overall. And that's not going to scare people away from Bitcoin. So make sure you guys are hitting that subscribe button. Hit the like button for me. Tell a friend to tell a friend. And I'll catch you guys all at the next one.